For the longest time, the USA basically looked like a lost cause for the Stop Killing Games movement. Compared to the UK and the EU, consumer rights were much weaker and not much seemed likely to change. But as of February this year, that's actually kind of changed a bit, because at least one state looks like it is starting to move. And it's in the form of the Protect Our Games Act that's been working its way through the state legislature in California. And as of last week, it's cleared another milestone. And it's one that could actually change end-of-life support for games in the US. It's fairly big, so today, that's what we're going to break down. Back in 2024, California passed AB 2426. Now, that is a law that actually made stores basically say whether you are buying a product or a license. Now, I can't blame you for not being aware of that law, and while there was no direct link, it's fairly interesting that shortly after that passed, Valve changed Steam's checkout notification to make sure that it's very clear that whenever you buy a game on Steam, you're actually buying a license to that game. That pretty much went out worldwide. It caused a whole big uproar. Now, of course, California is just one state out of many, but as of last year, it was also the fourth largest economy in the world. I guess it's a bit of a similar story to what we see with loads of EU stories, where if a company has got to comply in one big, huge market that they kind of can't really ignore, then it's often easier and cheaper for them to just harmonize their new standards globally. And that is why this new bill, championed by Stop Killing Games themselves, actually does matter. It gives license holders new protections and consumer rights. Okay, we've done the background, so now let's talk about the actual thing itself. This is AB 1921. It's the bill that we're talking about, and it's called the Protect Our Games Act. It was filed by 6-year veteran Assemblyman Chris Ward, and he's basically a guy with a marked interest in consumer affairs. I mean, in the same month he introduced this bill, he also reintroduced legislation to ban surveillance pricing. It's what I'm going to call a more descriptive way of talking about dynamic pricing, something that people are really afraid of coming to their grocery stores. Which would be pretty rough. But as I think you can now gather, it's really no surprise that Stop Killing Games would want to work with a guy like him, with the interests that he has. But as they put it, it does actually go further up than that. Stop Killing Games' new EU rep, Moritz Katzner, confirmed that he was collaborating with Ward on the drafting before handing it off to the Stop Killing Games US team, who would continue to work with Consumer Reports. So, that's a bit of background. You may be wondering then, well, where actually are we in the legislative process here? It was filed February 12th, and it's had hearings through March and April. It still does have a ways to go, I need to be clear about that. There's a financial review and then votes in the Assembly and the Senate where it could be amended before it gets over the line. But as of now, the important thing is it just cleared the Privacy and Consumer Protection Committee and the Judiciary Committee. So it's passed a lot of stuff. It's becoming increasingly likely that this could actually happen. So with that in mind, there's the obvious question. What is it that all of these groups have just approved? Though first, I've got an upgrade to my battle station that I'm so goddamn hyped about. It's from our sponsor UGREEN, and here it is. This is the Maxidok 17-in-1 Thunderbolt 5 dock, and it is a monster. It's also gorgeous, like the aluminium, the way it catches the light, the colors. I love the warmth. It's gorgeous. It's just one of those pieces of hardware that I kind of love having on my desk. But, you know, there's also what it actually does, and that is a lot. It's got 17 ports. There's Thunderbolt 5 running at 120 gigabits a second. And to give you an idea of performance, it can run a single 8K display at 60 Hz or dual 6K at 60 Hz. Absolutely wild. Now for my workflow, it means that my NAS, display, all peripherals run through this while I can edit and move huge files around, and it's even got a built-in M.2 NVMe slot that'll take up to 8 terabytes. And it's a properly engineered enclosure as well, so your thermals are going to be handled. Absolutely brilliant. Now, the total system power is 240 watts, and that means that my laptop that powers everything can get up to 140, and then you just have loads more power to spare and put into other things. And the end result of this is I've got my Mac Mini plugged into it at home, running as a server, then one cable, put my MacBook in, the whole workstation just whirs to life. It's absolutely awesome. And you can check it out at the link below. I think UGREEN have absolutely knocked it out of the park with this one. This bill applies to any server-dependent game that is sold, quote, on or after January 1st, 2027. And except for post-life support under the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, it breaks down into 2 periods. Those periods being before a game's official support ends and after the game's support ends. Here's basically the upshot. Before support ends, the operator has to give users a 60-day warning both in-game and on the company's website. They've got to explain when service ends, what features will go along with it, what security risks there are, and in the bill's words, and this is probably the big thing for many of you listening, quote, how the purchaser can continue to use the digital game or obtain a refund. Because after service ends, that is where this bill honestly gets real spicy, real interesting. So, after service ends, the operator can't sell the game anymore, and they're legally required to provide one or more of the following. Now, there's a few things here, but you know what? It may be dense, but it may also be rights that some of you guys over in the States will have, so buckle up and listen, it's actually important. Okay. A version of the digital game that can be used by the purchaser independent of services controlled by the operator. So basically, you get a version of the game that you can run without the servers being up. B, a patch or update to the purchaser's version of the digital game that enables its continued use independent of services controlled by the operator. C, a refund in an amount equal to the full price paid for the digital game by the purchaser. So those things do seem quite good, but there are some exceptions. This law actually would not apply to subscription games that tell users that their access is tied to their subscription. Now, this does actually line up with the 2009 Final Fantasy XI precedent. There's other games though, so free-to-play games are just out of scope of this, and the same goes for any game that you can just download and play permanently without server access. So, with that in mind then, let's test this bill against a game that is actually hitting its end of life pretty much right now. And that game is Battlefield Hardline, which, rather appropriately, is set in LA. You know, you're going around doing your shooting on the Hollywood Hills. Now, on March 23rd, EA announced that the console servers for this game would shut down on May 22nd, so no more online play, no more DLC. That makes it a perfect example, so let's see how this game's shutdown measures up against the letter of this new law. Okay, 60-day warning. Tick, they've done that. EA publicized this on their website, though it's unclear if there was a warning in the actual game. Let's be harsh and say that they're half right, but let's be real, it doesn't really take that much effort to put a little message in a game. Continuing on then, they've given players a clear date and a clear list of features that will end, but they haven't told anyone about any potential security risks or the lack thereof. And that is relevant, there may be no security risks, but they should at least have said that per the letter of this law, so let's be harsh again and say that they are 2/3 right on that count. What about post-support then? Well, Battlefield Hardline will still be playable in some form. You're going to lose your online features, and there's no bots-only mode anymore, but hey, you can play its campaign on consoles. Yeah, I'm sure several people are excited about that. Now, is that enough? That's the big question. Answering it does take a little second because it does mean we got to go into the weeds. So, the bill says a game has got to maintain, quote, ordinary use of core features, quote, consistent with reasonable expectations of a purchaser based on marketing and whatever information was available at the time of the purchase. Now, if you read the PlayStation Store page for this game harshly, you do see that the only caveat about losing online access is basically one about needing PS Plus. Because of course it's an online game on PlayStation, but the game is still playable, at least in part. So, what's the upshot of this? What's the upshot of our working example here? It would come down to whether a California civil court would believe that EA did right by their players. And I think you can see here that on paper, even if they, well, definitely could have been clearer on some of the details, EA broadly has complied with an interpretation of this law. No refunds are required, no alternative versions are required, so whether this law would actually change anything for a game like Battlefield Hardline and its players basically comes down to how harshly, quote, reasonable expectations gets read. Because remember, it's about the reasonable expectations of someone at the time when they're purchasing the game. So it's one of those situations where one phrase in a bill can absolutely just make the difference, and entirely depending on how someone chooses to read it, and perhaps how well they are able to argue their read of it. And all that's before we even get to the opposition. Because yeah, there's opposition to this that we should talk about. So, as you'd expect from any attempt to shift the US games industry, the ESA opposes the bill. Their concerns are basically the normal things. They argue that the previous bill, the one clarifying what is a license versus what is ownership, that basically should already be enough for consumer awareness. But they also fall back on one of their old arguments, which is this: that licenses limit how long a game can legally exist, meaning that forcing support changes at the closure of a game service would basically put way too much work on the company. Of course, many of us would hear that and say, boo-hoo. But on this bill specifically, they do actually have a point. You see, there's no carve-out for pre-existing games. Now, that means that every back catalog title that's still on sale come January 2027 would fall under the law. So your EAs, Ubisofts, all those companies would suddenly have to either work out refund plans, which would obviously be really expensive, or of course rebuild plans. And those would be rebuild plans for games that they shipped a decade ago, right? So that's going to be kind of tricky. Now, Stop Killing Games' argument has always been that if you develop with end of life in mind from the beginning, this is basically a non-issue, right? You're not going to have some crazy big cost because, well, you would have anticipated whatever the technical requirements of end of life would be at the time you're actually making the damn game in the first place. I think they've got a good point there. Now, obviously, as time goes on, technology can change, and that could change end of life stuff, even if end of life was considered at the beginning. But the big thing with this law is it basically being retroactive and there being no carve-out for games that basically are just sitting there in back catalogs. So even though they've got a point, you do need to remember that the ESA will always try to take up these oppositional positions, right? Because any change at all is a risk to them. And I mean, we know it's a risk. You know it's a risk. I know it's a risk. We may think it's a risk that is completely fine for the ESA's members to deal with, but obviously it's a risk. They're obviously going to fight back against it. And of course, in this case especially, the one that really would be tricky is the refund enforcement piece. That's one they'll likely be challenging during legislative review and again after, should the bill pass. I mean, telling a company to either rebuild or refund their customers is all well and good when we're talking about an EA or an Ubisoft. But where you could start to see some issues is, say, smaller devs building non-live service games who would be subject to this type of thing as well. And to give you an example, think of Last Flag. Now I bring it up because it's an interesting case of where a law like this could be good or could be kind of bad, and in an unintentional way. So that's a game that came out recently, and whatever their resources are at the end of that game's service, well, a law like this may be the difference between whatever little amount of money is left for maybe paying staff and making another game, or simply just, well, going bankrupt. Now, I bring that up not to be anti-Stop Killing Games or to be against this bill. It is just to say that whenever we're dealing with legislation, we need to think, yes, about the first order effects, the things that we care about the most, the reasons why that legislation is coming into existence. But we also need to be careful about the second order effects, right? About the externalities, about the knock-on effects, because sometimes you can still have well-meaning legislation that ends up doing harms in ways that maybe could have been hard to predict. So that's one little example. That being said, when I think about the direction of travel here, I do think more consumer protections is certainly a good thing. And if we're being realistic, this law is not reaching the public without heavy scrutiny. Some of that's already happening. Now, if it does reach the public, then it will likely be challenged in both local and federal courts as well. And that's going to mean years of fighting before anything really changes here. That is, of course, if it changes at all. Which could leave you thinking, the legal system, it takes such a long time that I may as well just stop caring. What's the point of any of this? Well, I can talk a little bit about what the point of this is. This bill may not be the slam dunk consumer rights extravaganza that some people hope for. I'd say it almost certainly won't be that. It may not stop companies from turning off games and leaving players with half of what they paid for, especially because what we've covered now is likely the best version of this bill before it's altered with amendments or watered down through the legislative process. Which, probably will happen. But it will still set precedent. It will still inform the direction things are going in. That kind of does matter. It's a little bit like how the main bill we're talking about today actually builds on the earlier one that we talked about, 2 years ago? The one that was about licenses versus purchases that kind of led to, Valve making that clear in the Steam checkout. It's the kind of thing where that progress and that precedent does actually open the door for more legislation. And even outside of California, well, other states could pick up similar ideas. And given California's global weight, well, precedent set there does not stop at the state line. This is not perfect. It is only a start, but you know what? That's actually what progress kind of needs. So often we think that progress is going to be this magical thing. We all have some bill, some law, some politician, some whatever it may be that we kind of fight for and we want to get them in or get the thing passed or whatever it is. And then, of course, you wake up the next day and very little has actually changed. Maybe within 1 or 2 years, very little has actually changed. But if you change your time frame to be 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, you do actually see that change compounding. You do see how one bill kind of set up another bill, and while none of them are perfect, it ends up being a bit of an improvement. I know that's not the most crazy, exciting thing, but you know what? It is actually progress, the type of progress that can actually matter and maybe set some global precedents. And it does seem that Stop Killing Games is actually making progress there. Today, we talked about it in the context of California, and very recently we talked about it in the context of the EU. And if you want to see just how, warmly the EU seems to be receiving a lot of their thoughts and their advocacy, well, you should check out this video next.